Being a CISO is like waging a never-ending chess game against players you don't know, can't see, and attack without warning. On this podcast, cybersecurity experts have a pragmatic dialogue on cyber risks, current attacks, and security trends. Welcome to the CISO's Gambit.
Today, I'm joined by two cybersecurity revolutionaries. Bryan Green, the former BISO of a little company named Salesforce, and Brad Moldenhauer, the originator of the CISOs Gambit and the former CISO of a leading legal firm, Steptoe Johnson. Bryan and Brad will be sharing their perspectives for what's coming in 2022 and applying some of the lessons learned in 2021. Bryan and Brad, thank you for coming on to the show. Appreciate you guys being here.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Looking forward to the dialogue today.
Question for you, Brad. Everything that has happened in the last 3 months, let alone the last month and a half with everything that happened with Log4j, there's certainly some things that we can predict are likely to continue to happen. But I'm really interested, from your point of view, what are the things that you're looking at and saying, this looks like it's maybe more of a trend and actually a full-blown change, or something that you feel that is currently trending that might kind of die off?
Based upon what we saw in 2021 with the threat landscape and some of the magnitude of those attacks, I think that this year, and look, I don't want to start on a bad note, but I think it's inevitable, right? So I think what we've seen, if you look at that collectively, is that critical infrastructure is now a prime target, right? And so I unfortunately expect that, national critical infrastructure, and that's not just limited to the United States, but in, the global economy will be the main target for both cyber criminals and what I would call digitally capable nations. And attacks will blend across operational technology, which we see in a number of leading manufacturing firms, and information technology systems. And ultimately what that does is it drives up the complexity of defense and response for IT security teams. And I think that, a lot of the ransomware gangs out there have seen that attack in particular is most successful when it impacts an organization's customers. So attacks will be designed to impact service delivery of these organizations. And when we couple that with critical infrastructure, the targets of these attacks in particular, I think are going to be, telecommunications, healthcare, government, energy, transportation, and even water management systems. And that's really concerning. But it's where I think that we've been trending. So I think now what we can safely say is cyber attacks are everybody's problem now, right?
Or let me ask a question on that, Brad, though. So are you saying then that there will be more of a concerted effort on the side of the attackers to really go after large things like utilities, et cetera, et cetera? Are you suggesting or saying that it's more nation states type activity or just pure for-profit criminality that we're looking at dealing with?
I think it's a little bit of both, actually, really, because the days of attacks being highly opportunistic, I think are down now. They're much more targeted in scope, especially with some of the high profile attacks that we've seen. I don't think that, when you saw the Colonial Pipeline or, some of these other big name organizations that have been impacted throughout the years, I don't think that this was, hey, let's just send out a series of phishing emails to any address that we've gotten off the dark web and let's see who takes the bait. I think that those were timed and targeted attacks to, really look for financial gain, or who knows, just to disrupt the global economy. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point, Brad. I agree with you 100% on the critical infrastructure. That certainly remains, top of mind. And frankly, from a national security perspective of the utmost importance, you sort of spurred a memory for me with the opportunistic comment. I was actually thinking about opportunistic in a very different way. So, for example, what we've seen with, ransomware and cyber attacks and those sorts of things, attackers and threat actors are very much opportunistic in the sense of look at healthcare institutions or some attacks that we've seen across the higher ed spectrum, where they know open enrollment, for example, or if hospitals and other healthcare organizations are under attack, there's certainly an opportunistic way in which folks would pay ransomware and those sorts of things if they're being able to unable to deliver healthcare and those sorts of services during these critical times.
Bryan, I was fortunate to catch a portion of your talk, but I do recall one thing that you had shared, which was the nature of the ransomware attacks continues to evolve, right? So before it was give me some money or you don't get your data. And now it's continuing to evolve to where you do get your data, but I'm going to leak it anyways unless you pay me more. Do you consider that trend to continue? Do you think it's going to go all the way to where it's both just the double, triple extortion, or do you think it goes in a different direction?
Yeah, you raise a good point, Sean. What we originally saw with ransomware when it started was exactly as you described, just a single extortion, pay us or you don't get your data back. And then obviously folks were restoring from backup and sort of, circumventing their ability to extort folks. But what we're now seeing is exactly as you described, sort of those triple and quadruple extortion mechanisms where, they'll encrypt your data and they'll exfiltrate it, steal it, and then they'll also hit you with a DDoS attack. And then now what we're also seeing is threat actors are doing all of those things, and they're also communicating with your customers. They'll say, hey, did you realize that, this bank has disclosed your data, or there's been a breach at this bank? Have they informed you? And they're starting to, turn the pressure up and turn the heat up on the victims.
So that kind of trend then, as the ransomware threat actors are continuing to get more and more aggressive and trying to shake people down even more. How do you see that, Brad, affecting some of the things you mentioned earlier, which is it going to be the continuous ransomware shakedown that we've seen over the last couple of years? Or do you see it evolving into something different that is just malicious for malicious' sake?
Yeah. Well, if you take a look at the evolution of ransomware, it's quite fascinating, really, because it's almost like you can see the thriving business model, right? I think that at one point it was pretty much seen as an equal opportunity attack, and any organization can become a victim, right? But as time went on, and organizations got more mature with, say, their DR and business continuity capabilities, ransomware actors were getting flustered. Right? They would have a successful attack where, hey, we've landed a beachhead, we've moved laterally, and we've encrypted all their data, and we've given them the ransom request, and they would never hear back because customers were then restoring and reconstituting their data from, say, a cloud backup or some secondary or tertiary form of data recovery. Right? So what did they do to kind of circumvent or countermeasure that? Was they added data exfiltration to their repertoire, if you will, right? And I mean, that's a really interesting advent before, because when it came to classic ransomware, I would say we were all focused on the prevention of compromise and lateral movement. Now we need to really hone in and add the prevention of data loss to that as well. And what makes these, what I think is really scary about this is, we have the nation states who are involved in this, not from the actual threat actor perspective, but the ones that are putting out cybersecurity regulations, right? And what these malicious actors are doing is they are using these cybersecurity regulations and weaponizing them to leverage the threat of having to pay a hefty compliance fine. So, for instance, you are a hospital that has been hit by a ransomware attack with an extortionware element. That means they have exfiltrated a bunch of protected health information. Now, you have the option of reporting that to, whoever and paying that compliance fine as it's written to the law. These ransomware gangs are very well aware of what that cost would be. And don't just stop there. Think of GDPR violation, which is very prescriptive in what the financial penalties would be. Well, they know to lowball that. So, it's almost like, okay, well, hey, I can pay this, get my data back and not have to tell anyone. That is very alarming.
So, Bryan, one of the things that you had mentioned in one of our earlier conversations was around the continued rise of cryptocurrency, right? So my mother being from El Salvador reminds me every day that El Salvador is the very first country in the world to adopt Bitcoin as a national currency. She's very proud of that. She doesn't know what it is, but she's proud of it irrespective of that. Are you seeing, as it relates to payments and ransomware, et cetera, and the continued explosiveness of things like Bitcoin, do you think it's also going to be utilized for the greater good in the cybersecurity space? Or the use cases are still going to remain around currency, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a complex one and a great question. I think that it's like most things, I think it's a double-edged sword. I think there are absolutely positive benefits from cryptocurrency at large, and frankly with blockchain as well. But as we painfully know, there are nefarious uses for crypto as well, right? Just the decentralized nature and the inability for the legacy sort of financial controls and export controls. In which nation states, try to impose sanctions and penalties and those sorts of things. Extremely difficult, right? Which is why we're really struggling. I love that you brought up El Salvador. I think maybe you took a sneak peek at my notes. But it's very interesting to see El Salvador adopting or accepting crypto as its national currency. It's pretty amazing. And for those of us who are interested in cryptocurrency, it's a very interesting development. So, Sean, to simply answer your question, I think, yes, the proliferation and the use of cryptocurrency will continue to be a cause for good across the world. What's going to be very interesting for me in 2022 is going to be what ultimately happens in the verdict from the Security and Exchange Commission versus Ripple. That lawsuit's been ongoing for a couple of years now. And I think, I think from a trend perspective and from an outcome perspective, I think it's going to have, ripple effects across, no pun intended, ripple effects across the cryptocurrency world. How will governments treat crypto? Do they treat it as a currency? Do they treat it as a, how are they thinking about it? Which will, ultimately imply some sort of regulatory and compliance and governance restrictions with it. So it'll be very interesting to see. And I think hopefully in 2022, we'll have an outcome to that.
Bryan, for the audience and other folks like myself that aren't that familiar with that particular case, could you give us a quick overview as to what's actually happening and what's the thing that's being litigated?
Yeah, and I'll give you my disclaimer that I'm not an attorney, but the net of it is that the SEC is suing executives at Ripple for allegedly raising funds by selling XRP, which is a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, BTC. Effectively as an unregistered security. So these executives raised literally, I think, a couple of $1 billion by selling these unregistered securities, according to the SEC, versus an initial coin offering. So they're, how the crypto was brought to market is the concern of the SEC. So there's a lot of really competing, legal opinions on this and so on. So, the court case has been dragging on for some time.
Yeah, that's something we definitely see a lot. I was watching a YouTuber who's exposed some of the pump and dump schemes that are around crypto, where you have individuals, if they were dealing with, let's say, securities, it would be securities fraud and definitely would be in prison. But effectively promoting cryptocurrencies that are DOA, but getting enough people to buy in, they sell at the very peak. They exit their position and they walk away with tens of thousands, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of profit, unfortunately, all on the backs of the people that are supporting them. That is a very disturbing trend. And I can see why the impacts of that particular lawsuit and the outcomes could be really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's for all intents and purposes, it's the Wild West. Governments don't know what to do. Ransomware and threat actors are taking advantage of being able to use cryptocurrencies to extort folks. And frankly, even just look at the price of some of these underlying, assets or equities or whatever we're calling them today. The price fluctuation, these crypto winters where, the price is, moving, 30, 40, 50, 60% over a relatively short period of time. You don't see the NASDAQ or the Dow doing that or other exchanges across the world. So, it's the Wild West. And, I think the parallel that I draw is, this is like the internet in the late 90s. And, no one was able to look into the crystal ball and guess or, understand how and what the world would ultimately evolve into. But here we are. So, I look at crypto very much through the same lens.
Yeah. And, I would just add to that. That's exactly my perspective too. I mean, you kind of said it. I love that expression. It's it's in its Wild West stage because it's an absolute magnet for theft, hacks, and fraud, right? I mean, realistically, it's a criminal's utopia. Right. I mean, the low bar of entry for fraud, it's just, frail and disjointed regulations, a notable absence of effective law enforcement. I mean, you could go on and on. So ultimately, I mean, I'm just kind of keen, to see until we have some kind of regulation that establishes a framework of rules and law enforcement evolves its capabilities for investigation and prosecution, attackers are just going to run wild. So it's a perfect analogy, Bryan.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the funny thing to me is I see a lot of real estate that's listed. It gets all this headlines across the news networks like, house for sale and the owner's accepting payments on crypto, and Tesla's online store is accepting crypto for t-shirts and things like that. So it's all of the things you said, the criminal's utopia, but it's also businesses are actually using it for good purposes.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, coming from the legal industry, I'll tell you guys, there's a number of law firms that and mainly the big ones that have huge blockchain practices. They actually accept cryptocurrency payments from their customers now. Absolutely. Yeah. So I don't want to make it sound like it's all bad because, there is a school of thought that says, well, we can get rid of ransomware by eliminating cryptocurrency. Okay, well, you need to think about it from a world economic standpoint. That's easier said than done. And law of unintended consequences. What will that do other than get rid of ransomware, which it probably would not?
No, it would just shift back to wire transfers to offshore accounts.
Venmo me $2 million.
Yeah, exactly. $500 million Venmo. Could you imagine that? What would be the VIG on that? That'd be like what, 3-5%? Jeez. Some of the case law, Bryan, is definitely one of the things you're looking at in terms of our prediction of 2022, that there's going to be effectively potentially monumental change in that aspect of the market. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. Absolutely.
Earlier, we were talking about the continuation of cyber attacks, specifically on the industrial and areas that have traditionally been kind of ignored outside of state actors. Now, granted, we saw the Colonial Pipeline situation, which happened last year. I think we've all kind of talked about that situation to death. But as you're looking forward to this particular year, is there something else that's sticking out and you're going, man, like if this continues down this path, it's going to be really good or it's going to be really bad?
Yeah. So, something that's bothering me, and I'm sure in your guys' engagements, you're being asked about this a lot too, is, the role and function of cyber liability insurance, right? Well, I think most of us have all come to terms with, hey, this is something we need in order to, do business. But what we're starting to see now is I've been questioned by a lot of people that have said, hey, because of a lot of these huge ransomware attacks, a lot of people are filing claims, right? And with that, what we're starting to see is, and this is a real concern, is that now, these cyber liability insurers are essentially adding some kind of assessment, to how they come up with their premiums, right? And look, we know insurance companies are here to make money, right? And my concern is something that I've already seen, that we've all seen and maybe not thought about, but is some of the compliance regimes out there. Like, I don't want to call anyone out specifically, but, sometimes we're administered questionnaires that have dated security control requirements in them. Like, as an example, a litany of security controls around the protection of data on compact discs. To me, what that is a culture of controls that is focusing on adding additional controls to make up for the shortcoming of others that have failed. And the efficacy of those is no longer relevant. So these compliance regimes or standards or questionnaires are being heavily influenced by certain security vendors that are trying to protect their profit streams. But their controls do not properly mitigate risk. And what my concern is now is that some of these security players with dated security architectures and solutions and approaches to how we implement controls, their connection to the insurance industry is going to be to promote those dated architectures, right? So, as an example, if your insurance broker issues some kind of due diligence assessment on your environment and you don't have signature-based antivirus technology, you don't get the good driver discount. Yeah, so that is a dangerous trend or prediction that I have that I hope does not come to fruition, because we need to be more forward thinking in our security transformational approaches, not these incremental changes or staying with the past, the things that led to a lot of harm for many of us.
Yeah, so you bring up a very interesting point that is, I think, endemic to the technology industry as a whole, which is getting a bill of goods of capabilities or outcomes that were promised that are ultimately not delivered in certain situations, right? Now, I recall some years ago, there was a massive lawsuit against an organization that had created a stints for people's hearts that was effectively allowing them to continue to live life without having to have major surgery. It turned out that in that situation, they were defective and people died because of it. In our industry, yes, the loss of life could be one of the outcomes of a negative cyber outcome. But what I have yet to see, and I'm sure it's happened, I'm just not aware, is vendors and or providers of solutions getting in the line of fire from the actual consumer / user of said technology and being held into account for the technology not delivering what it's supposed to. I mean, we could argue that the last 15, 20 years of kind of legacy architecture and approaches has led to the sorry state that the industry seems to be in now. Do you think that this is something that could potentially expand to further include vendors in that regard, to where the insurance company starts finding them liable?
If you notice, when there is a really big high-profile breach, sometimes we'll see a couple varying responses to it. Sometimes it's to, look at the threat actor and try to blame them for what happened, which, by the way, we all know that's an uncontrollable variable. Okay. We need to understand that threat actors are there. We need to understand their motives, but that's a variable that we cannot control. Okay. What we can control is our vulnerability to whatever it was they exploited. Right. And I think that the point you're bringing up is fascinating now that I'm giving thought to it. It's when it comes time for that, and we're actually kind of, we're past incident response and recovery, and now we're doing lessons learned and really documenting that after action report, is maybe filing attribution to the security control that failed us and really caused us harm. Because, and the reason I bring up the anecdote that I did about those compliance regimes, and I'm sure you guys have sat through this as well, I'll have some third-party assessment of risk where somebody comes in and they're administering these questions. And, let's keep with the example I brought up. One of the questions will be like, how often do you update your DAT files with your antivirus program? And that's kind of where I just start running down, and probably not what they want, but it's what they need, is really kind of a coaching session where it's like, okay, we're talking about controls. Let's start asking some basic questions, because this is what I do in my environments. Does that control actually prevent a risk? Is it executed manually? Is it scalable? Is it verifiable? Is it sustainable? Is it scoped appropriately? Right? When you start adding all these things up, for me, it's pretty simple. It's like, okay, that control is either strong, insufficient, or flawed. In this case, it's flawed. So you know what? I'm not going to keep spending money on it. I'm going to redesign it and remove it. Right? And I think that that would be really interesting if people started looking at it from that perspective. Now, there is a secondary school of thought to that, which is, well, maybe the solution we had in place could have prevented what happened, but we weren't properly using it, or we didn't have the technical wherewithal to understand how to properly enforce that.
Brad, you started this conversation down sort of an insurance and cybersecurity liability angle, so I'll continue on that. I think one of the challenges we have with that particular industry is ultimately they don't sufficiently understand or know how to effectively measure the efficacy of security controls. So as a result of not being able to do that effectively, what they do is they in turn just become overly prescriptive, right? And they start getting into sort of, referencing some of these, what we sort of, talk about as legacy security controls, like you mentioned, DAT files and, firewall segmentation and DMZs and, all of these sort of very legacy type of terms that we don't, that we're trying to, with Zero Trust, move away from as an industry. So I think, there's these sort of this problem of these lagging indicators where these insurance companies and these underwriters and these people who are trying to be the arbiters of risk, they just don't sufficiently know how to do it. And frankly, they're just, the tail is wagging the dog effectively. So I don't know how we as an industry continue to make progress in this, but I think it's like everything, it just continues to evolve and they're trying to do what's right, but they're in a losing game here in a lot of respects.
Bryan, is there anything you'd like to leave the audience with, some key takeaways that they might be able to utilize in either their additional research or conversations with us or with the rest of their peers?
I think for me, I'd like to end on a positive note. And I think, when we talk about risks and threats and all of these bad actors, it's a little bit of a downer, right? So I think for me, at least, I think how I'm thinking about this is, as we move to Zero Trust and as we modernize our infrastructure, just start thinking about this less about, doing incremental change and more getting into just more comprehensive, holistic change, rethinking legacy architectures. And I think we recognize as an industry, it's a very difficult thing to do, right? To sort of move away from the way in which we constructed and architected networks and cybersecurity controls in the past and start thinking about them in a more, public cloud centric security as a service type of model. I know that it's a very difficult transition, but I think, with that comes a tremendous opportunity to really build systems that are, scalable and much more, much higher efficacy as we move into this sort of new world. So again, appreciate the time and thank you so much.
Bryan and Brad, thank you so much for joining us today. If you enjoyed today's show, please subscribe or comment. If you would like to hear specific topics or have feedback on how we can improve the show, please let us know. We take everything from the audience to continue to improve the content that we provide to you. Thank you so much for your time. You've been listening to the CISO's Gambit. I'm your host, Sean Cordero.
Content on this podcast may contain forward-looking statements that are current as of the date of recording and subject to change. These statements are subject to the safe harbor provisions created by the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act of 1995. Full legal disclaimers are available at revolutionaries.zscaler.com.
Copyright 2022.